Hey folks, welcome back. This is Joel, and in this video we will slightly move away from our SDN discussion, which we have been doing a lot of late, and move towards another interesting topic, which is network automation, right? So it's going to be a very interesting discussion, right? So I'm trying to not have a major agenda, for this, maybe this and few other videos in this series. Rather, it's going to be come as may, right? Like I want to quickly show you a bunch of things which I do when I talk about network automation, right? So it's going to be a very free-flowing kind of a video without a predefined structure as such, right? Okay, so that said, let's dive into it, right? So it's going to be a kind of like a very interesting review or a revision if people are trying to prepare for DevNet exams and so on, right? So that said, the first thing which I want to touch upon before you even get into the whole basics of network automation is that uh, to understand some of the basic differences between the various data formats which are out there, right? So you probably would have seen XML, right? You would have seen JSON, and you probably would have seen the other format, which is your YAML, right? And just always remember, these are not data models; they are data formats, right? People always seem to get confused with this piece, so it's very important to know that. So these are various ways of representing data. So maybe I can show you. I think I have it here. I think I put filled up. Give me a second. Right. So I think I should have a bunch of examples here. Let me just show you here. Yeah. So XML is pretty straightforward, right? It's very close to your HTML as well, right? So you have a bunch of tags. As you see here, this is just like a food menu which has been represented in an XML format. You have some kind of tags, and every tag has to be closed. Like for example, the tag which starts here, it gets closed over here, right? And every single tag, it starts, and then you have something like you have a closing tag as well, right? Sorry, this one. And the other thing is inside the tags, it's kind of like a nested representation, right? So you have a tag, inside that you have another tag which is food, and inside that you have name, right? And that also is getting closed, right, of this sort, right? So it's a very straightforward, and it's been there for ages, right? Most of the legacy applications kind of support XML, right? Extensible markup language, right? Some of the old frameworks like SOAP used to use this. Now what I did was I took the same XML and I used XML to JSON converter to show you the same data in a JSON format, right? So on the left hand side you have XML, on the right hand side is JSON. Now what do you see here? In JSON, you see it's the first thing what you see here is it's more pretty, right? It's more easy to understand, and it's more machine readable, right? I mean, I would say even XML is machine readable, but this is way more machine readable, right? So you don't have a closing tag, to be more specific, right? So you see here you have key value pairs, right? The same data has been represented here. You have the breakfast menu, which is the outermost tag, which you see here. It has been converted into a key, and there is nothing which closes it, right? So it's all key value pairs, right? And you see here the food tag was repeated, right? Probably 5-6 times for every single food menu. But here what I could do is I could convert that into just one key, and then I have put a list over here, right? So this particular key, food key, basically now has a list of all the various food items, right? And then inside that you have the key value pairs again, right? So this is more like a nested key value pair kind of a situation here, right? Again, there is no loss of data. The exact data which was there in XML is visible here, right? Now moving forward, the next one, YAML, right? How does YAML differ, right? So YAML is something like this. So you have you need to put in these 3 dashes which kind of represent it's a document, it's a new document. You can have one YAML with like multiple documents. You just need to repeat those 3 dashes. But then the whole idea here is that you see you don't have the whole concept of putting the whole flower brackets and so on, so that's been removed. But the extra piece which is added here is the indentation, right? The indentation is very important. If you see here, look at my indentation. It's starting from here. It's going one step inside for food, and then there is another step which is steeped in, and all of that, all of the key values are kind of like forming or following the same indentation. So that's very important, right? So I would say personally, if you want to like compress the data and send it over the internet, then probably use JSON. But at the same time, if you want want a better readable format, then I would probably choose YAML, right? So that being said, so these are various data formats, right? Never confuse that with data models. You will understand what data models are later, but these are the data formats. The other piece probably which you should also remember is the kind of data types which are allowed, right? So here you see there is a string data type, there are numbers, you can also have boolean, right? You can also have a boolean. At the same time, you can also have a JSON object as well, right? Inside a particular JSON object. So it could be like something like a nested object. Even that is allowed, right? Similar is the case for YAML as well. You have the data types and only those data types are allowed. In fact, in YAML, I think you're allowed to have strings, and in fact here everything looks to be a string. But ideally, you can have strings, you can have integers, you can have floats, you can have boolean, right? But just yeah, I did not want to dive deep into this. To start with, I just wanted to clear the confusion which exists with like data formats. All right, so the second piece which I want to discuss is that let's start with I mean, all of us probably already know automation, right? It's basically nothing but a small script which is going to do some task for you, right? So that's something which is very, very universal, right? And the concept of automation is probably there in every industry. But with very specific to networks, right? Why do we need it? Why do we need network automation? Right? So this is a very important question before we actually dive down. Now, some of the use cases, right, of network automation would help us answer this question. Like for example, you want to do something like monitoring, right? You want to do something like a monitoring of your network, right? Right. So when you talk about monitoring, something like monitor your CPU or threshold and see if it is crossing a certain values, right? So there are a lot of use cases for monitoring. Similar would be for I would say provisioning, right? Provisioning is another very interesting use case which you get to see a lot on the field. Now when you're talking about provisioning, this is where all your Ansible and all of that kicks in, right? So especially if you talk about provisioning Ansible, how does Ansible work? Like again, we'll probably discuss Ansible in detail later, but just to give an idea, you have something like templates, right? You create a lot of templates. Sorry, you create templates to do a certain function for you, so do a certain task, right? And then you can have your device YAMLs, right, which is basically spread across different platform, different vendor, right? So all these various devices can now reference this particular template, right? So that way you can like prevent manually. First thing is you can prevent manually going and provisioning these services or these particular use cases. At the same time, you can reuse these templates, right, across vendors and across platforms, right? So we'll obviously discuss more provisioning later. uh, then I would say things like migrations, right? When you want to probably upgrade some of your devices, right, to probably a new platform, new code, or something like that, right? Automation comes over there. The other interesting piece or the most important piece is the config management, right? Config management is a big problem, and there are a lot of solutions in the industry which has tried to solve this, and you see new solutions coming in and day out, right? And so when you talk about config management, you just need to remember that it's not about just configuration, right, of the devices. I mean, that is fine, that's something most of them do, but the other important part is also making sure that you can build you can kind of like monitor the state of the devices, right? So that's very important. So if you can define a desired state, right, for a particular network device, and if your config management system can automatically, configure that for you, right, that is going to have a lot of value, right. The other piece is policies, right. So if you can do something like a self-healing system, right, so you see a particular link is going down, and you kind of if you can have some kind of an automation which is going to automatically create a policy and prevent the damage in the network, right. So all of these are the reasons why why we gotta automate the network, right. uh, I mean this is probably not frozen, the list is not frozen, there could be a lot other reasons as well, but these are some of the most important ones which you get to see day in and day out with a lot of networks. All right, so the next piece of discussion probably I would call is the network APIs, right? I mean, whenever you start building an application, it could be any kind of application, not just a network application, right? You always look for APIs. You always look if that particular whatever you're trying to access, does it have some kind of APIs, right? So network APIs, when we talk about network APIs, I would call out three important things here, right? Let me just reduce the size here a bit, right? So when we talk about network API, we have your SNMP, right? Pretty old school, I would say. Then netconf, which is getting a lot of traction now, and then the restconf, right? So there's always a bit of confusion involving all these three guys. And obviously you have your CLI. I would say over here, right? Everyone uses CLI. People say CLI is dead, but I don't see that happening. Network engineers will always use CLI for troubleshooting, right? Old habits die hard. But if you look apart from that, right? When you talk about SNMP, so SNMP was mainly designed to kind of like collect data, right? Just to collect, using you can do it different ways, right? You configure various traps, and then you generally have a network monitoring system where you collect these traps and then you analyze the data and so on, right? So, but then SNMP was not mainly built for configuration part of it, right? And the other piece of SNMP is that it is very very vendor specific, right? The SNMP MIPS and all of that is going to be very vendor specific. So you can't build scripts or you can't build automation which uses SNMP and which is going to be universal, or which you can like apply across vendors or various platforms. So that's where the netconf kind of kicked in. And other piece being SNMP is also not very secure, right? I mean, I know the latest one, version 3 probably is, but then it's still UDP based, right? So you don't have any kind of error control and all of that, right? So yeah, so those are bunch of things about SNMP, right? Now network APIs, when you talk about, the next thing is the netconf, right? So I'm not sure of the exact date, but I believe it was somewhere in the year 2006, around that time, when IETF actually came up with your RFC and all of that for your netconf, right? So netconf protocol has been there since some time, but it hadn't gained a lot of traction until recent, right? So when you talk about netconf, right, there are a couple of words which always come buzzing. One is your XML. Actually, let's make it three, right? XML, RPC, and YAML, right? These are the three important words, right? You will always, or terms which you will always hear when anyone talks about netconf, right? So XML is nothing but a data encoding format, which we just now already saw right at the start of this session. RPC is nothing but procedure calls, right? So these are as simple as saying, if you have a router here, and let's say you have your laptop where you're running some kind of a script, right? So in case of netconf, a very interesting thing is you always call the router as your server, right? And and the laptop, say, or the system from where you're running the script, right, is going to be something like a client. Now, anything which is exchanged between these two guys, it's actually done using, RPC messages, right? So procedure calls. These are RPC is a very famous term if you are again talking in terms of software development, right? Every single function, when it calls another function, there is some kind of an RPC which goes through, right? Now, every single call, every single exchange which happens between these two guys happens via the RPC. One example of RPC is something like get config, right? So if the client basically sends this RPC to the server, the server obviously will respond back. Obviously, considering all the authentication, all of that happens, it's going to respond back with the configuration, right? Could be running config or a standard config or something like that, right? So the other thing is Yang, right? So Yang is a data model. We will obviously see a little more of Yang later, but for now, just think of Yang as a data model, which means uh, it's just a structure. It's just a predefined structure, right? So that both my server and the client can understand each other, right? You might ask me, why can't I just use something like a JSON here, right? Or why can't I use some other why can't I just use a data format like we talked earlier? But you can't use a data format here. We need to have some kind of a predefined structure which is like a universal, right? So if you look at something like Yang models, which we'll look later, if you look at Yang models of interfaces, it is predefined, right? Predefined by an authority, something like IETF, right? And that's something which is universal, which means Cisco, Juniper, and any other vendors are going to follow it. I mean, yes, there are going to be vendor specific Yang models as well, but I'm again talking mainly with respect to the standard Yang models, right? So the reason why there is a specific terminology, and why there is a specific model built and not we are not using some random JSON key value pairs, is because we want to create something universal, right, and standardized, centralized, so that everyone can then use the same thing, right? So there's no gap over there, right? The other thing is netconf. Maybe we'll talk a little more of netconf later, but I think this should kind of suffice here. The other thing is the restconf, right? So people realize that I'm not exactly sure of the year when this came in, but people realized that XML was a little difficult to deal with, right? I will show you a format of the whole netconf protocol, how it works later. But for now, just look at this. Every single call, every single discussion which was happening, or every single exchange which was happening between the server and the client, it was happening inside an XML. I just showed you how the XML looks like, right? It's a bit complicated when you look at your JSON, or when you look at your YAML models, YAML data formats, right? So everything was happening inside XML, right? So if I have to formulate a particular query, right? If I want some information from my server, which is like a router here, right? If I want some information, I had to kind of like create a very let's say very robust XML query, right? So I had to create a XML message over here. Now this was very difficult. I mean, again, not very difficult, but then it was not very easy to use, right? So people thought, how about changing this? How about we don't use XML, right? How about we make it easier? And that's where the RESTconf came. And RESTconf is kind of like built on the REST API, architecture, right? In a REST API architecture, what you do is you have the same router, you have the same, say, client, but then now every communication, right, will be happening via something like a HTTP request, right? This is pretty simple, right? HTTP, every single call which you do from a browser, all of that happens using the standard, there are a lot of standard methods like get, post, and so on, right? So people realize that how about we just use something like JSON with a get or a post method, which is very commonly used, which everyone is probably familiar with, rather than creating this huge tedious XML, right? literally what we did was whatever this RPC calls which were there, which is the get config RPC calls, were kind of replaced by the HTTP get and post methods. As simple as that, right? So that's where REST conf is, right? So REST conf, when you hear about REST conf, again you hear a lot, mainly with respect to JSON, right? Is a term which you probably hear a lot. REST API, because again it is based on that, right? And then you obviously will hear about the HTTP methods, right? Like get and post. All right, so we'll obviously dig a little more into netconf and restconf, because that is going to be a very important part of our discussion as we try out some scripts and all of that in the future. But for now, this is pretty good. We will obviously, like I said, double click on this in the future, right? That said, let's actually look at, so we discussed why network automation, right? But again, we were loosely using the word automation over there, right? But let me actually try to, you would have heard of a lot of terms like network programmability and network automation, right? So let's try to debunk that, right? So what is the difference between network, not sure if this is visible, right? Network automation versus your programmable, let's just say programmability, right? So what is the difference between network automation and programmability? Now when you talk about programmability, you're basically like going back to what we were doing for a long period of time, right? So you had like a Python script here, right? A .py script, and it it's going to probably either talk to the device directly using CLI, probably using some kind of a REST API, which in which case it's going to be more like a JSON, right? And so on. Now if your use case is to just automate probably one router or one switch, I would kind of categorize that as programmability, because in when you talk about network programmability, you're basically concentrating more on this piece, right? How are you interacting with the device, right? Rather than giving more importance to the whole at automation perspective, you're talking about how you can connect to the device, right? Either you want to use netconf, you want to use restconf, you want to use CLI, JSON, right? uh, all those questions come into play. But when you're talking about automation, it's a huge thing, right? So when you're talking about network automation, you can't just like build a small script, connect to a device, change the host name, and assume that you have actually achieved network automation. No. When you talk about network automation, right, some of the very important pieces which I would like to call out are, have you kind of achieved uh, a self-healing, right? Or to start with, let's say, forget about self-healing. If I can kind of, I think I mentioned this earlier, but let me repeat it again. If I can define a desired state for my network, right, and let the tool or the script, whatever you have built, take care of it, right? If I can define an intent, right? So intent could be anything. Intent could be something like, hey, I have this app, right? So your software developer is gonna come and tell you, we have to deploy this app, and this particular app would need a certain amount of bandwidth, right? Certain amount of access, and so on, right? So this is your intent, right? And is your network automation in place, or is it smart enough to configure the network based on this intent, right? So that's the whole direction where you gotta think when you talk about network automation. Second thing is something like a self-healing, right? I mentioned the word self-healing. Self-healing is, like I said, especially when you talk about WAN connections and so on, there are many cases where probably a connection breaks, and you have to quickly have policies in place which can, make the network resilient, which can switch back the traffic to a more better link, or probably send the less critical traffic to the internet, and probably a more critical traffic using the other backup WAN link, and so on, right? The other piece is your automation, is it vendor specific, or can it be applied across switches and routers, right? Can you apply it across switches and routers, or is it just going to work on one single router or one single platform, right? So this is where I would like clearly call out, right? This is why I wanted to put this piece out here, because in our day-to-day instances, we generally do program it. We kind of concentrate a lot on the network programmability aspect, because we always are interested in understanding how I can interact with the device, right? But I think there should be a major switch from this thinking towards this, right? Because this is, yes, important, but along with this, you also need to think about, when you talk about network automation, you need to think about how intelligent you can build your script or a tool so that it can do most of the work for you, right? um, you know and how it is going to interact with scale, right? As in when you add more and more devices or varied platforms, how does it scale up, and is it self-healing, right? So all of these various factors kind of helps you transition from network programmability towards network automation, right? And that's where some of the tools like your Ansible comes into play, right? Now, I mean, I think we have kind of reached a place where Ansible is used a lot, right? I don't know at one point of time that transition happened, or at one point of time everyone decided that Ansible is going to be used. I mean, there are still a lot of other platforms like Nomad, and a lot of them, a lot of open source ones. But I think if you look at a larger scale, and with the adoption, I think Ansible has kind of spearheaded this whole transition a lot, right? And there are reasons for it as well, right? So when you're talking about automation, like I said, the important reasons why I think Ansible is kind of chosen nowadays is because automation, yes, is important, but along with that, it also does orchestration, right? So when I talk about automation, it just tells you what you need to do, right? You want to configure an IP address, great, that's just automation. But orchestration, right, is another very interesting piece where we are telling when you should do it, right? So you have, for example, you want to configure an IP address on an interface. That is cool, but is your script or a tool intelligent enough to figure out that what if the interface doesn't exist, like a loopback interface, right? If it doesn't exist, then your script should be able to create the loopback interface and then put the IP on it, right? So that's where the clear distinction of what and when comes into play, right? And I think Ansible is something which you can, is where I mean you can achieve all of that using Ansible. Obviously, the other reason being Python. We are all big fans of Python. Pretty easy to use. Ansible is built on Python, right? Python, and then it's also the reason being it is free and all of that, right? You don't have to pay anyone for using Ansible, right? The other piece is it is agentless, right? So you don't really have to deploy an agent in your network to do anything. You just need to have some kind of a reachability, right? The other interesting piece is open source, right? Because it is open source, you have a huge lot of modules which are out there, like thousands and thousands of modules, right? And that makes Ansible like a huge catch, right? So now you can use all these modules which have been written by people all over the world, and you can leverage them. The general structure, if you want to like quickly have a look of for Ansible, is that you generally have something like you have a playbook, right? um, Let me just pull this up here. So in Ansible, you generally have a playbook where you define certain tasks which your automation tool should do, and that's generally written in YAML, right? Now, which in turn, this playbook will in turn what? It will use some kind of modules, right? So these modules are again internally what they do is they basically convert YAML to like Python scripts which will go and do your job, right? So that conversion is happening in the backend. Now, but the big part of Ansible is this modules, right? So you can use huge amount of modules to do anything for you. Like for example, I think I've pulled up the whole Ansible documentation over here, and you can see on the left hand side, look at the list of modules, especially for network, right? You have ACI, you have ASA. I'm just again calling out only the Cisco specific ones, but then look at it, right? Like you have, oh, I see Junos as well, Nexus, NXOS is here. You have protocol specific, right? RESTconf, NetConf. So you have a huge amount of modules. iOS, I see iOS over here, iOS X, these are all releases or softwares which you use with Cisco devices, right? And these are huge set of modules which have been already written, so you don't have to spend time to write anything new, right? Like for example, if I go to something like NXOS interfaces, you will basically see that, you know, you can see the various values, the admin state, the delay, and all of that, and you probably will also see an example, right? So you just need to use this particular module, like for example, NXOS underscore interface, provide the name of the interface and what you want to configure, right? And Ansible will basically go and do it for you, right? How cool is that? I mean, just using a module, and if you can literally tell Ansible to do it, and it's going to do it for you, right? So the other interesting thing is you really don't want any kind of scripting knowledge to do this, right? It's all straightforward. It's you don't really need to write any kind of script. You just need to use this module as is, right? Probably obviously change the required values to the values which you want, and Ansible will internally, right, what I was talking here, this modules, right, will internally convert whatever you have written in your YAML. So this is literally YAML, right? Earlier what we saw, this is nothing but a YAML format. So it will convert the YAML format into into like Python scripts, and it will do the job for you. All right. So that being said, I think we have kind of quickly reviewed a bunch of things. But before I end this particular video, what I want to do is I want to also show you my development environment, right? Kind of like a to show you the various things which I run on my development environment whenever I write any kind of scripts, right? So to start with, if you want to write, I would say Python, right? So what I have is I have some kind of I have a Ubuntu machine here on which I kind of write my scripts and all of that, right? So I prefer this, but again, you can go back to using Windows. If you have a Mac, you can do it on that, and so on, right? But ideally, what I like to do is to start with, the first thing is probably, let me just note down those things as well, because it would be interesting to finally look at the various things we discussed, right? So um, just write it down here. Bunch of things which you would need to kind of build your own, say kind of like, let's call it as a checklist, right? So the first thing would be Python, right? The underlying environment doesn't matter. You are running it on whichever kind of OS, doesn't matter. So Python better have both the versions, right? 3 and 2, because most of the, 3 is basically which will be used, and it's going to work in most of the cases, but you might have some kind of libraries and all of that which might not work in 3, because they probably were written way back, right? So you'll probably need 2.2, 2.7 for that, right? The other thing is Git. Having Git is very important, right? Because just using one command, you can now kind of download anyone's repository and try, right? But there's like a lot of open source code out there when it comes to network scripting, right? And it was really foolish to write a script from scratch when if someone has already written something, right? So that you don't have to, waste your efforts. The other thing is having an IDE. I mean, again, there are probably a lot of people who don't want to use an IDE, in which case, great. But I sometimes use something like Jupyter, or sometimes I use something like, right now I think I'm trying out this Visual Studio Code, which is pretty cool. Right? It gives you a very, the reason why I like this is it kind of helps me to quickly change my Python interpreters, right? If I want to run something in Python 3, I can do that. If I want to do something in Python 2, I can quickly say. So you see on the left hand side bottom here, just by clicking this, I can change whichever interpreter I want, right? So that being said, you can use whichever IDE you want based on your choice. But this is pretty cool. You get you can do a debugging, you can do a trace. Also, you can like store all your scripts in a particular workspace and run and so on, right? So that's the IDE part. And probably you would also need some kind of Python packages, I would say, which are very popularly used, in a network development setup. Will be something like NC client, right? Something which I use personally almost every day, which is used for all your netconf related scripts. You probably also need something like requests, because RESTconf, right? you want to do anything REST API, you want to have the requests. So all of these can be installed using the pip command, right? Most of them would have tried it already. Then something like maybe XML related stuff, XML to dict, I think is another very interesting module, and all of that. So again, all of this you can install it on the fly whenever you need it as well. So the other thing is probably, okay, the other amazing thing would be to, check out the developer.cisco.com, right? You have amazing resources out here, and you find documentation to all the APIs and all of that put in one single place. Apart from that, these are two things which I really love, right? One is you have all your learning stuff here, the first three, but sandbox is again very interesting, where you can, now there are actually a lot of sandbox devices or sandbox labs which are actually on always 24/7, right? So you don't even have to reserve them. So you want to test something in your netconf related stuff with the iOS XE device, you don't have to do that. You don't have to reserve any devices. Rather, I think it's a bit loading now. So you just need to obviously log in. I'm going to log in with my Cisco, probably, or maybe let me skip that because probably will take some time. But then that's the thing, right? You can log into sandbox, look at the various sandboxes which are there for various platforms, various releases, right? Almost every of Cisco's technology is here. The other thing is the code exchange. The code exchange is a place where I was telling, where you can just use the scripts which people have written, which people have contributed to the community, right? So you can again select based on your needs, right? You can explore, you can select the language, like for example you want something in Python, you want to switch to a particular technology and so on. You can select that, like for example networking, and I'll probably see a lot of scripts which people have written, right? I think, in fact, I kind of downloaded a bunch of scripts from here to test it out when I was trying out Yang and netconf and restconf and so on, right? So let me just write that also to the checklist, which is to explore your sandbox, or let me just say DevNet, right? DevNet, mainly your sandbox over here, and code exchange, because you have like all of pre-written code, right? The other piece is the Postman. Having Postman is very important, right? Because we'll do a lot of uh, uh, stuff with APIs, right? So Postman is a very interesting tool which is going to give you a handy way of quickly testing some of the APIs, right? So turning on, right? So Postman is pretty cool. So you can see on the left hand side, you can like store some of the requests which you have done before, right? You want to try this request again, you can kind of like store them under collections. You can create a lot of environments, right? So let's say you have a bunch of environments where you want to test some of the REST APIs. Now you can store them. So like for example, I can select iOS XE and probably go and run this particular request which I had saved earlier, and it's going to run it for you over here, right? So see, I get the response. So uh, this is a very, very interesting tool. If I want to do the same thing, probably without Postman, it's going to be very difficult, right? I'll have to do a curl and open terminal and do all of that. But Postman kind of makes it very simple. So that's the next piece, right? Let me just put down as Postman. And the last one which I want to talk here is, if you're not just happy with the sandbox, right? What if you want to create your own lab? Now that's where you can, again, you have the flexibility to go and use a lot of tools out there. You can use things like Viral, you can use Eve, right? And the latest addition, you can also use obviously JNS3, right? And the latest addition to this list is the CML Labs, right? Personal edition, which I am currently using, or I'm currently testing it out, right? The Cisco modeling labs. Pretty cool it is actually. In fact, I've kind of installed it and I put in a bunch of devices just to test how it looks. And this is literally the first review, I would say. It's looking pretty good. I mean, you have all your devices here, right? All of the images are pre-given to you. You don't have to struggle to upload any of these images. They are pretty much there. Almost every device which you want. You can see your nodes as well, right? Your Ubuntu devices. I see vBond, vEdge, all the SD-WAN devices. You can see iOS, Nexus, CSR 1000, all of that, right? You can put that and then you also have this whole external connector, right, which you can now, which means what I do is, I have this Ubuntu machine, which is my development machine, and I can connect to my CML labs, right, using something like a external connector, right. So my PC or the Ubuntu machine kind of lives inside this cloud, and from there I'm able to bridge that connection to my, you know, lab, which I'm the network lab which I'm building over here, right, and I'll be able to have a quick connection, right. We'll obviously look into this more in the subsequent videos, but that's also a very important need. I mean, again, like I said, most of the stuff which you want you can achieve using sandbox, but if you yourself want to try out some complex topologies and so on, and you want to build something on the fly, then using a network simulator, a emulator mainly, would be a good option, right. So that's something which we discussed today, or at least in this video. Hope it was useful. We discussed a bunch of things. Like I said, there was no specific structure to this series. I want to keep it very simple, very flexible, and just go with the flow and try to discuss the various things we are going to, which engineer is probably going to leverage as they try their hands with network automation, right? Just to recap, we talked about, I think, data formats. Then we talked about why do we need network automation. We talked about the various network APIs, right? CLI, SNMP, NetConf, RESTConf, right? We talked a little more deeper, but we'll probably get more deeper to the into this, as we proceed. We talked about the mindset which has to change from just talking about network programming to network automation, which would involve a bunch of things, and Ansible is playing a key role in driving that change. We talked about the importance of modules, and if you want to build, or if you want to kind of like do a lot of hands-on, these are a bunch of things which you need to kind of have set up on your environment, whichever environment, be it be Windows, Mac, and so on. You've got to have a bunch of things over here which will kind of like help you ease into the whole network automation phase, right? So thanks a lot for watching, and do tune in. We'll do a bunch of labs with this in the coming videos, and hope to talk to you more on this. Thanks for watching.